Okay, so we're starting now finally with I mentioned this last week. I think I'll repeat it. He's probably one of the most influential philosophers of all time, right up there with Aristotle. Whether you like him or you hate him, he had a big impact on the field. So, and that goes for not just philosophy of art. In fact, that's probably what he's least known for, even though he's well known for philosophy of art. But he's probably better known for his ethical philosophy. And after that, his response to some of the epistemological debates from the modern period. And so let me go get this chat box open just so I can see your chats. And let me get the slideshow going. So we're reading selections from the Critique of Judgment. Kant wrote, I guess, his three major works, you could say, or the three critiques. The big one is the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason. And this is really his answer to the big debate between the rationalists and the empiricists and whatnot. We'll talk a little bit more about this. We've covered Hume, obviously. We talked about Hume last week pretty extensively. So, you should already be somewhat familiar with the empiricist and what empiricism is. We're going to have to talk a little bit about the rationalist, what's rationalism, and that sort of thing, and then where Kant kind of fits into this. But back to where I started, right? I was talking about the three critiques, his three major works, and the first one is really the Critique of Pure Reason. This is a response to this big debate. After that, you get the Critique of Practical Reason, which is using your reason in action, and it involves ethics and what the right thing to do is. And the Critique of Judgment is where he deals with, well, among other things, judgments about nature and science, but also, for our interest, judgments of beauty. What does it mean to make a judgment that something's beautiful or not beautiful? When we're making these judgments, what is the impetus for that? What is the framework for those judgments? So we're going to have to talk a little bit about Kant in general in terms of his approach to, I think, fully appreciate his aesthetics. But I want to try to keep it at a minimum because Kant is, he's famously a difficult thinker to wrap your mind around. So we'll try to keep it as simple as we possibly can. But anyway, so I guess maybe I could start with David Hume since we've already covered him, and so maybe that's a good place to start. As far as these three doctrines are concerned, the rationalist doctrine, the empiricist doctrine, and Kant's response to these two philosophical approaches. Sorry about the noise. I think I've mentioned this before. I live really close to a busy street, and it's like drag racing on the weekends over here. So occasionally I got people with their hot rods, their muscle cars driving by. Yeah, exactly. Cargo burr. Yeah. Anyway, so I gotta get used to it. Anyway, so maybe I can try to make my cadence sort of align with rhythm to like the light right down the street. So I'll pause right when the vroom vroom goes by. But anyways, back to Hume. So David Hume, okay, again, empiricist. So what does that mean for us insofar as we're taking a class in philosophy of art? Well, remember, empiricism it's an epistemological theory, has to do with knowledge. How do you know what you know? Where does knowledge come from? And the empiricists say that it always comes from experience. So when it comes to aesthetics and what is beautiful and what is good as far as taste is concerned, the way Hume approaches it is completely based on what we get from our experience directly, and what he says generally pleases us. The things that are good, that are considered objects of good taste, are things that generally please. And so it's all based on experience. All of our concepts, including the concept of beauty, is based directly on our experience. Now, what about Descartes? As far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, but as far as I know, Descartes never wrote any treatise on philosophy of art. But he's a good representative of the alternative view, the rationalist view of and this is an epistemological view again. It's a theory of knowledge. And what is his position? Well, if Hume says that knowledge is always gained through experience, right? My concepts, all of them, what Hume calls my thoughts and my ideas, are always based on my impressions, what he calls impressions, which we might call our senses, our feelings. We might have a list of all that, but he's got this catch-all phrase, impressions, what I've felt with my emotions, what I've seen through my senses, my concept of the color red, for instance. I have that concept because I've seen the color red with my eye. If I were blind from birth, I would not have a concept of red. I might know the word, but I wouldn't be able to picture a color red in my mind. Now, Descartes is, on the opposite end of the spectrum. Again, the empiricist, knowledge based on experience. For Descartes, he's going to argue knowledge is only based on reason. Reason is primary. Our ability to understand concepts and to apply that understanding to our experience, that's what makes knowledge possible. So one of his, he's probably most famous. Well, he's famous for a lot of things. If you're a math major, you might know about him from, all sorts of, geometrical truths that he's uncovered. He helped develop. In fact, I think he actually just did develop. I don't help develop, but he pretty much developed analytic geometry. The whole XY coordinate plane, that's the Cartesian plane. So he was, a very mathematically minded person, and he thought that concepts, that's where it's at. Your understanding of concepts, reason, and your ability to apply reason, that's where knowledge comes from. And so, his famous quote, probably his most famous quote, is, "I think, therefore I am." So you might be familiar with that quote. That's Descartes. So what's his argument for this position? Remember, David Hume's going to say, look, if you haven't had a direct experience of it, how could you have the concept? For instance, how would you understand what an avocado tasted like if you've never actually tasted an avocado? That's not something you could explain rationally to somebody. You have to directly experience it. So anything that I conceptualize for David Hume can be reduced to something that I've had experience of. Hume admits that our mind can do things with our experience. We'll experience a mountain, for instance, and maybe we'll see a big pile of gold or a picture of some gold or something, and we'll imagine a golden mountain, even though there's no such thing as the golden mountain. But even when we use our imagination, we're drawing from our experience. But Descartes says no. If you look at the way we understand certain objects, for instance, around us, he looks at this piece of wax. Descartes does. He says, "Well, look at this wax that I have. If you want to tell me that my knowledge of the wax comes just from my senses, that can't be the case, because there are things I know about this wax." It's actually a honeycomb that he's looking at. So he's got this fresh honeycomb, just came from the beehive. It still smells sweet. So his senses tell him, it has a certain shape. It's been cleaned and dried, so it's hollow. And if he hits it, it makes a sort of knocking sound. He can sort of tap on it. It has a certain shape, smell, a color to it. Once he takes that honeycomb and he puts it near the fire, all of those things have now changed. So its flavor is no longer there, its color is changed, its shape, it's now melted into a puddle. And yet he knows, Descartes says, I know it's still the same wax. How do I know that? I can't know it from my senses. Why can't I go with just my senses? According to Descartes' argument, you might say I could. David Hume might say I can, but why couldn't I just go with my senses alone? Why couldn't I just say, well, it's the same wax? So the senses tell me, I'm looking at the honeycomb. It has a certain shape, certain color, certain smell, all these things I'm looking at through my five senses. Now I put it next to the fire, and it no longer has the same shape, no longer has the same smell, no longer has any of that. None of that is the same. And yet I still know it's the same. I know it's the same wax. Why does Descartes say that my senses alone? What do you think his argument? What would I have to? It's turned into a different thing, Gerardo says. Yeah, so if everything about it that my senses is reporting is different, then I would have to say that it's different, that it's not the same wax, that it's some other object. So I'd have to call it something else or think of it as something else. But obviously I don't do that. I know it's the same wax, argues Descartes. And the reason I know this is because of my understanding, what he calls my understanding. I have an understanding of wax. I know that wax melts and that wax can be changed into all these different shapes. And so it's my understanding of wax, not my senses alone. If it was my senses, I'd be lost. I wouldn't know one moment from the next. There's a sort of continuity, despite all these changes, and it's my mind, my understanding that gets at that. And it's not my imagination either. So, like, and Kant does this as well, but he does something different with it. But Descartes distinguishes between what he calls his understanding and his imagination. I think sometimes Kant uses the word cognition but he's talking about the same thing. The understanding is merely it's your mind being able to comprehend the truth of some concept. You understand something. You understand that wax takes on different shapes. So even though it looks different, it's really the same thing. That's the understanding. It's not the senses that show you that. It's your mind that tells you that. You understand through reason, rationalism. But the imagination for Descartes is something distinct. It's not the same as the understanding. The imagination is your ability to envision things, to picture things. Your ability to, for instance, close your eyes and picture a triangle, or to close your eyes and picture a purple dinosaur, right? Barney dancing around or something, right? So he says that your imagination, although that's a part of your mind, it's not necessarily your senses. That also has nothing to do with your knowledge of the wax. And he argues for this. He gives us a couple examples. He says, well, think about this. There's something that all of us know about wax, and all of us know it, and we don't know it through our senses, and we don't know it through our imagination. And what is it? Well, there's probably more than one thing, but for instance, I'm assuming everybody here knows the answer to this. If you just think about it, you might not know immediately, but just reflect on it. How many different shapes can wax take? Like if I have a glob of wax, how many different shapes can I turn it into? Is there like a number? How many different shapes can wax take? Infinite. Yes, infinite. I like Gerardo's answer. All of them? How many shapes are there? I would say infinite is the answer. Whatever shape there is, it can take. Yes, exactly. How do you know that? It's true. We all know it. We just think about it. So Descartes' like, you just think about it. It's just your mind, your understanding. You didn't look. Did you sit there and look at a ball of wax one day for an infinite amount of time and watch it turn into an infinite amount of shapes with your senses? Did you imagine it in your head? Did you sit there and imagine an infinite amount of shapes, all the different possibilities? No. You might have started that way, like thinking about it, but eventually your understanding came to truth. And so your understanding for Descartes, that's what's primary. Your reasoning ability, your rationality, so hence the rationalism. So that's his basic argument. And we've seen Hume's argument. It's basically kind of an appeal to your experience. Look, what concept do you have that can't be traced back to experience? All of them can, without exception. Hume says even the concept of God, and that's a big problem for Descartes, because Descartes thinks that the concept of God couldn't have come from your experience. But Hume says, well, you've had experience of your own mind and your own thoughts, and you've had experience of wisdom, and you've had experience of goodness, and you're able to just imagine a being that has all those qualities to perfection with no limit. That's all you think of, and so all of these things Hume thinks can be traced back to experience. Now Kant, as I said, now finally we get to Kant. He comes somewhere in the middle. He's going to say, look, you're going to have both. If you're just a mind, and without any images, no imagination, without any senses of anything external, then you're just an empty vessel. There's nothing there. On the other hand, Descartes got a point. If you were just simply taking in your senses and that was all, there'd be no coherence. There'd be no understanding. There'd really be no experience at all. In a sense, it'd be chaotic. Every moment would be different and disparate. So, there's something our mind does to organize our senses. Our senses take in all this stuff, and if there were no senses, there'd be nothing. But on the other hand, if there wasn't a mind to interject, to sort of bring it all together and to organize our experience, that wouldn't work either. So Kant's in the middle here, right? It's not just your senses. It's not just your mind. It's sort of a coming together of the two is a better way to look at it. So, if you look at, I've got these pictures here. These are, you'll see these in a lot of philosophy textbooks will have pictures like this, where you'll have somebody, maybe even psychology, you might see pictures like this in the psychology textbook. This is a typical way that philosophers will explain the problem that's really being put forth here by a lot of these epistemologists during the modern period. People like Descartes, David Hume, and then finally Kant, who sort of comes in and synthesizes those two views. But this is the one way you can look at the problem, or one of the major problems with philosophy during the modern period, is trying to square your experience of the world with the way things actually are. So, we've got this image here. We got, this person staring at the world, looking at this kitty cat out there. And one of the big issues that, like Descartes, for instance, was dealing with was, how do I even know that there even is an out there? How do I even know there's a kitty cat out there? Maybe everything's a dream, right? Maybe my whole life's a dream. Like, I don't want to believe that, Descartes says. I don't want to be this like crazy skeptic who doubts everything. But he just lived through the Copernican revolution. I'm going to get to this in a minute. What's the Copernican revolution? But what's the Copernican revolution? I'm going to talk about right now. But how does that apply to philosophy? We're going to get to that in a second. But Descartes asking himself, how do I know anything? How do I know that I'm not in the Matrix? Of course, that movie hadn't come out yet, so he had to make up his own little sci-fi story. But, he told himself, he's like, for all I know, this whole reality could be like a simulation. It could be some evil genius tricking me. So there's no kitty cats. There's no body. I don't even have a physical body. I'm just a mind. So how do I know anything? And Descartes, as much as people rail against him during his own lifetime, during the modern period, and even today, he kind of sets the stage for philosophy for the next few hundred years. You could argue even up till today with these sort of questions. How do I even know anything objectively? How do I know it's not all just in my mind? How do I know what the thing in itself is? I've got, look at this little kitty in my mind. I'm having this experience of a kitty, but are there even any real kitties out there? And Descartes, he obviously has his own approach to doing this. He thinks that if we use mathematical reasoning and understanding, because we are rational beings, thinking things, and we don't rely too much on our senses, and in fact, are very skeptical of our senses, and only assert what we can prove mathematically, then we'll be okay. We'll be all right. We'll get to what Descartes calls the thing in itself, what all these philosophers call the thing in itself. I've got how I experience the kitty cat. You might experience it different if you're standing over in the corner and the lighting's different. The cat might look different to you. If you're another organism, if you're a fly, like a house fly, buzzing around the house looking at the cat, it will look different. So what is the actual cat, apart, separate from my experience? Well, as I said, Descartes and most of the other rationalists sort of take this mathematical approach. And to their credit, some people think that their approach doesn't work. It doesn't really get to the thing itself. But to their credit, you could argue it's the foundation for the modern scientific approach, the modern scientific method. But when the empiricists come along, and they also, I think, should get a little bit of credit for that as well, for helping, helping, I guess what you mean, develop modern science as we know it, like the beginnings, sort of the birth pangs of modern science, uh, post Copernicus. And Copernicus, just real quick, remember he's from your history class. You should know this by now. I hope. Maybe you don't, but he's the one that first introduces the idea or the concept of a heliocentric model of the universe. So instead of having Earth at the center of the cosmos, which was the belief of the classical world, all the Greeks and the medieval scholars thought that Earth was in the center and all the other planets were around it. Copernicus thought, well, no, maybe the Earth moves and it rotates around the sun. And this is the beginning of the modern scientific revolution, and the philosophers are trying to deal with this, and that's why Descartes takes such a skeptical approach. How can I know anything? You know, I lived through all these changes. Really smart people were completely mistaken about things, and it seems so obvious. It doesn't feel like the Earth is moving. It doesn't feel like it's rotating on its spinning on its axis. That's you know, it seems ridiculous, but it's actually the truth. So they take this problem very serious. And again, his solution, Descartes, the rationalist solution, is to use mathematics to extract everything from experience that you can count and you can measure, and then to understand the properties of that. And that will get you to a good physics and a good natural philosophy. The empiricists, people like David Hume, you know, they have their own different solutions. They're all kind of unique. But in general, they try to get away from this thing in itself. You know, whether you're John Locke, whether you're David Hume, Berkeley, all of these, you know, most of them are British, it seems. There were a few continental empiricists. They tend to just say, forget this thing in itself. Locke says, okay, I believe there is a kitty cat out there. I believe it, but all I have is my experience of it. So let's just make sure that we can find some rules or uniformity in our experience. That's what we need to focus on. And David Hume takes a similar tack. He's like, well, maybe there is something out there, maybe there isn't, but does it really matter? Who cares? Let's just look at our own experience of the world. Let's try to find out what can humans know given our limitations, and what can't we know, and be very content with that. We're never going to get to an absolutely objective knowledge or some mathematically precise knowledge of the natural world. We won't. It's all just going to be based on probability, on possibility. Well, Immanuel Kant, you know, he reads the empiricist, and especially when he reads David Hume, and this really upsets him, because before he reads David Hume, he's pretty much content being a rationalist. So Immanuel Kant thinks, look, Leibniz, who we haven't even mentioned yet, Leibniz, this other rationalist, and particularly this follower of Leibniz, his professor, Christian Wolff, these guys are right. Rationalism is right. Stick to mathematics. You get to the thing in itself. You get to pure knowledge of things as they truly are, and you don't have to worry about the skeptic and all that stuff, and we've solved all the problems. And when he reads David Hume, he said that it awoke him from a dogmatic slumber, and so he had to sort of change his ways, and this is what makes him right. All the critiques, the first critique, the second, and the one that we're going to get into here just in a moment, the critique of pure judgment. And as I said, his solution is somewhere in between. He's not an empiricist, so he doesn't think knowledge is solely based on experience, but he's not a pure rationalist either. That you need more than just a mind, you need more than just understanding to get at knowledge, to get at experience itself. So not just knowledge, but just experience at all, just to have any sort of form of human experience. Both the mind, the understanding, and the senses, the perceptions, these are necessary. So as Kant puts it, I'm actually going to skip this next slide and come back to it. Kant says, concepts without percepts are empty, but percepts without concepts are blind. This is one of his most famous quotes. Kant is not the most quotable philosopher, so you don't see a lot of Kant quotes, but when you do, you'll see this one occasionally. And it's not really the clearest quote, even though it's probably the clearest of Kant. What is he saying here? This is actually a response to the whole debate between the rationalists and the empiricist. The first half of this quote, concepts without percepts are empty. This is a knock against the rationalist, people like Descartes, who think that our perceptions are completely misleading. They should be discarded. Anything from our senses is unreliable, it's uncertain, and so therefore, for the most part, we should just stick with what we can know through the mathematical reasoning, concepts alone. And when you get to people like Leibniz, I mentioned him already. Leibniz says something to the effect that, this is true of all of them. The way he puts it, though, is kind of Stellendenken, no representational thought. If you can picture it in your head, it's not abstract enough. So if you're thinking about circles, if you're picturing circles in your mind, you're a weakling, a philosophical weakling. You're not strong enough. You're not rational enough. You're not abstract enough. You have to think about circularity, the property of circularity, without any picturing of circles or anything like that. That's a lower order of thinking. So absolutely abstract, no spatial content. And many of the empiricists, they claim that's absurd. That all thought, like Berkeley would say, that all thought has some content to it. All thought has some, perceptual content. Even if you talk about circularity itself, you're using language to think about the properties and all this. So that was sort of Berkeley. Although you might say, and I think Kant kind of gets to this when we get into the reading. You'll see that Kant seems to think there are some intuitions that we have that don't really have any representative or representational content. You can't really represent them to yourself in a picture or anything. It's just sort of a sort of emotion or gestalt or something that just sort of takes you over. A kind of I hate to use the word vibe because that's not the most academic word. There's sort of a vibe you get that doesn't necessarily have it's not a word you're thinking of. It's not a thing you're picturing. You're just feeling something. And that's going to be, I think, key to Kant. But Kant is, I think, somewhat, he's sympathetic. That's what I was looking for. He's somewhat sympathetic to the empiricists. Look, if all you have, let's just say you were a pure mind, nothing but mind, and you had no body, you had no senses, you had no imagination. All you did, all you were just a thinking thing, and you'd never had any sights or thought or sounds, no smells, nothing sensual had ever touched your thought, but you were just a mind alone. What would you be thinking? Has anybody in here ever been inside of a sensory deprivation tank? You know what a sensory deprivation tank is? It's like, I think there's at least 2 or 3 places. I've never done it myself. I've always been curious, but you can go into these big sensory deprivation tanks and you float in water, and the water eventually it adapts to your body temperature, so you can't even feel yourself. You can't even feel physically there, and it's all completely pitch black, no light, no sound, so no senses at all. So Nathan, you've heard of them. Do you know what happens usually when people go into those things? At least according to reports, what do people usually experience, or what's the point of going in? I guess it's supposed to be meditative, right? But what? Nobody knows. Yeah, hallucinations. Yeah, Park's got it. Yeah. Like they probably nap or go crazy. I like that answer. They probably take a nap or go crazy. I love it. Yeah, I would like it, but I might take a nap too because I was so relaxed in the darn thing. But yeah, I can understand the crazy part. I don't think I go crazy because I like to. I mean, I meditate. I like to chill and have no. But I think some people are so used to having constant inputs and this sort of thing, and so but yeah, so for Kant though, it's like there'd be nothing to see, and maybe even if that's true, like let's just say going into a sensory deprivation tank, you do hallucinate, which that's what I've heard. You start to see stuff, not like you start seeing monsters and stuff, but you start to like see colors, or you'll just start imagining things in your head, and so I mean that's almost like a point I think in Kant's favor here, and maybe the empiricist's favor too. A mind alone is nothing; it needs content. Um, on the other hand, yeah, the brain tries to fill the void. That's a good way of putting it, Nathan. Yeah, I was actually watching some interview. So I was on some podcast. I can't remember the Lex guy. Forgot he's some kind of science nerdy guy. But he was interviewing this neuroscientist, and she thought that and he asked her about dreams and psychedelics, I think, and she said, well, I'm not a specialist in that, but I know enough about the brain to where I think I have a pretty good hypothesis. She said that there's a part of the brain, and this is also very Kantian too. I think Kant would, hey, more evidence for me. She says there's a part of the brain, not even a part, it's a system of neurons, a neural system in your brain that basically what it does is it focuses in on only certain parts of your experience. It's sort of, so at any moment of time, we're getting an infinite amount of signals, or maybe not infinite, but a very large number of signals. I'm seeing, cars are driving by my window. There's a speck of dust on my desk. There's all these things I could notice that I don't notice, and I'm focusing on explaining Kant to you and explaining Kant's philosophy of art, and so my brain is, there's this part or this system in my neural circuitry that is responsible, sort of like a filter. It sort of takes all this stuff, and given my previous experience, under similar conditions, how did I adapt? What did I focus on? What was relevant? And it sort of adapts to that. Well, she says her theory is that when we're asleep, that part of the brain is relaxed. It's still active, but it's not as active. And so dreaming, when we dream, it sort of is unleashing all this stuff without any filter, and just sort of like, we just start seeing images and random stuff that doesn't seem to fit together or whatnot. And so that's what her theory. She's like, I'm not an expert on this, but if I had to, like, I would look into that. And she also thought that that's exactly what happens on like psilocybin or other psychedelics, is that function of the brain is cut off, right? And then you're just overloaded with senses, which is I don't know, I didn't intend to do this, but it's a perfect segue to the second half of this quote, right? So if you're just a mind, there's nothing to experience, right? Concepts without percepts are empty, but perceptions without concepts are blind. So in other words, if all you were was a perceiving thing, Descartes says I'm a thinking thing. That's what I am. I'm just a mind. Everything else is just conjecture. But if I'm just a perceiving thing without a mind, then that is blindness. That, every moment, Descartes is right. I'd have to say that the wax is not the wax, that every moment the wax changes, it's a different thing. So obviously I don't do that. Obviously I take this, what Kant calls the manifold of perception, like all the unity, and I make it to a unity of apperception. Like I make it into a coherent experience of my mind, of myself. And so the mind plays a role, and the senses play a role as well. They come together, and this is what makes experience. And so now we can back up. Let's go to that previous slide. I'm not going to get into the details too much about this because I want to get into his philosophy of art, but I think it's pretty key to understanding Kant's philosophy of art to understand a little bit of this stuff. But his kind of solution here is that, look, you've got what he calls these necessary conditions for the possibility of experience. By the way, I guess I never fulfilled my promise, so I'll do it now. That's what he means by a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Remember Copernicus, he starts a scientific revolution by relocating our position in the universe, right? Reframing the order of the cosmos. Now the sun is in the middle. Well, Kant does something similar in philosophy. He enacts a Copernican revolution of philosophy. And what he does is, like the empiricist, he rejects the thing in itself. You're never going to get to the object as it is in its pure state. You're always just going to have your experience of the object. And so now let's just focus on experience. Let's focus on what we do have access to, our own experience, and let's try to iron out what he calls the necessary conditions for the possibility of experience. And so that's the Copernican revolution. That's the focus. How is it even possible that I have any experience at all? And the answer, partly, I've already given it. I need senses and I need a mind. So they're both involved. It's not exclusively one or the other, as the empiricist or the rationalist might lead you to believe, that there's something going on in the mind. What the mind does, well, for one, the mind must always experience things under certain conditions. And this is what Kant calls his Transcendental Aesthetic. I don't want to get too much into this. I don't think it's that important for the reading, but it will come back when we get to his critique of different art forms and stuff. So just briefly, he says here that everything that we see is always conditioned by these elements. In other words, anything we experience or have any access to through our understanding is always conditioned by these elements of space and time. This seems like, well, once you sort of unpack what he's saying here, this doesn't seem like a very profound thing to say. All he's saying is that one of the necessary conditions for experience is that it takes place in space and time. Has anybody ever had an experience that was outside of space and time? Did you ever have this experience where there was no space and no time at all? It was no place, no duration, outside of space and time. Anybody? Yeah, I'm not getting any answers, so I'm assuming no. And if you have, you should message me privately and let me know where your connect is. I want to find out who your connect is. Yeah, when I'm dead, maybe, right? Yeah. For Kant, it's not possible, right? Even if, like, I'm kind of joking about the, hook me up with your dealer or whatever. Like, even a psychedelic experience, or like sometimes people say, well, what about when you're dreaming? Well, yeah, when you're dreaming, you still have an experience of space and time. Maybe it's in a coma, but you're that's not really an experience. If you're blacked out, you're blacked out. There's no experience. So he says, if you're having an experience, any kind of experience, whether it's a hallucination, whether it's a dream, whether it's waking life, it always takes place under the conditions of space and time. I mean, sure, they might be distorted, right? Like, have you ever had these dreams? I know I used to use an alarm back in the day. Now I just wake up automatically because I'm like Superman, but but I used to use an alarm clock, and I'd hit the snooze button for 5 minutes, and sometimes 5 or 7 minutes snooze button, you'd go back to sleep, and I swear there's been times when I had dreams, like a real quick dream. I'd go right back to sleep, get into the dream, wake up after the snooze button, the snooze went back off again, and the dream seemed like it went on very long, but I know it was only 7 minutes because because the alarm clock. So yeah, you've had that experience, Jessica. Yeah, see, so people have had it. So, but you still had an experience of time. Like, it was your experience of time was distorted. Obviously, sometimes if something's interesting or fascinating, then it'll go by faster. If something's boring, time goes by slower. But time is always an element of experience, and so is space. Lucid dreaming, what about it though? You're asking lucid dreaming. I mean, yeah, but lucid dreaming is still dreaming, and it still involves these elements of space and time. So again, all experience, whether it's sleeping or whatever. And so another, and I don't want to get I don't want to get into the details too much of this, but another condition or necessary condition for our experience, it's not just the aesthetic, the transcendental aesthetic, the way things appear. They always appear in space and time. They're aesthetically presented transcendentally in all cases in space and time. But another necessary condition is that all of our senses and all of our what Kant calls our intuitions, he uses these words in a very peculiar way. So intuitions, when you hear the word intuition, you're thinking like a gut feeling, like, oh, I have a gut feeling, I have an intuition about that. But he uses intuition to basically, it's almost like the word impressions for Hume, but maybe even more broad. It's like any input, anything that comes in is an intuition, I guess, right? So like anything I see, hear, touch, my feelings, my emotions, and representation of my mind, all like sort of, well, maybe not the representation, that scratched the last on the list, but everything that's an input is an intuition for Kant. A judgment, another word that Kant uses in a peculiar way, a judgment is pretty much any act of understanding. So anytime I understand something, that's a judgment. Anytime I understand that today is Saturday, anytime I understand that 2 + 2 = 4, these are all judgments. And so he gets to his famous categories. I think that's the term and if you read 95% of Kant translations, they'll use the word category. I think in our textbook, it might be different. It might be concepts, or it might be, I don't know. When we get to the quotes and into when it comes up, I'll mention it. But most people talk about Kant's table of categories. And what he basically says is that any act of judgment, any type of understanding that we have about anything is always because of a category. So for instance, when I say that all humans are mortal, that is a judgment I'm making, Kant would say. All humans are mortal. What kind of a judgment is it? He gives us a whole table with all these different types of judgments. Every judgment will express a quantity, a quality, a modality, a relation. I'm not going to go through all these. It's not important. But just for an example, if he says all humans are mortal, he's like, well, I know that's true, and I have this judgment about it. What kind of judgment is it? It's a universal judgment. So how do I make a universal judgment? And I must have an understanding of it. I must know what I mean. In order to know that, he says, I have to have a conceptual understanding of that. If I make a universal judgment, for instance, I have to have a conceptual understanding, a category of unity. So, I mean, again, I'm not going to go through this whole darn chart. If you want to, you can download this from our website and look. I mean, for fun's sake, it gets kind of tedious, but there's a one-to-one correspondence. He says these categories are necessary for our experience. We make judgments in our experience. We say, all men are mortal. All mammals are, all humans are mammals. We say this. So in order to do this, we have to understand what we're saying. To have an understanding, we have to have a concept. So there has to be this category of unity. I don't know. I guess we unify. We take, if I say all dogs are mammals, I'm taking all these different things and unifying them. Hey, there's that waggy tail furry thing. There's that four-legged waggy tail barking furry thing. There's that other one. They look different, but they have enough similarities. I'm going to label that dog. And I'm going to say that they're a part of this other category of mammals. And so in all these judgments, I'm unifying all these different things. Let's just do one more, and then we'll move on finally to the sort of the reading. For instance, I might make a particular judgment. I might say, I might point outside my window and say, that's a house. Okay, that's a particular judgment. I point to one thing, and I'm just pointing out that that's a house as an example of the group, the category of all houses, that this object belongs to the category of all houses. It's a particular example of this one species, of this one category. And so it's a particular judgment. And so Kant's going to say, well, how do I have an understanding of that? I said it, I know what I mean. Well, the understanding comes from my understanding of the category of plurality. So I know that there's more than one of these type of things. There's this house, there's that other house, there's the house next to me, there's the house behind me that I can't even see, but I know it's there because it was, unless it just disappeared while I was talking. And so plurality, there's many things that are the same type. One more real quick, this is a quick one. Singular, to say that, I don't know, this is my, vroom vroom again, this is my cell phone, okay? he says, well, I only have one, you know, so it's not, you know, I'm not some high roller here that's got like 4 or 5 different phones, like one for each social media account or whatever. You know, I'm not like a big baller influencer or something like that. So this is the only one. This is singular. There's only one. I mean, there's more than one of these iPhones for sure, but insofar as my phone, there's only one my phone, Travis's phone, Professor Ross's phone. So for him, Kant says I have to have an understanding of totality, because I'm treating this as its own thing. It's totally, all this all by itself totally is my phone, right? So all singularities are considered as totalities. All right, so, okay, enough of that. This is just Kant saying basically, look, the rationalists are kind of right. You need a mind to organize stuff. You need a conceptual framework to organize stuff. If all you were was just some sort of sensor that was just sitting here taking in passively all of these senses and all this experience, there'd be no coherence. So what the human mind does is it somehow organizes all these experiences into a coherent picture using these categories. These categories organize our senses, right? So I feel like I've said enough about Kant in general. Now it's finally time to talk about his aesthetics. And so, you know, here we got the table of judgments, and on the list, you don't see anything about aesthetics, and that's fine. He's talking about the understanding in general. But when we get to aesthetic judgments, you know, he wants to ask this question: what type of judgment are they? Like he says stuff like, what is it? Ethical judgments, for instance, are they're synthetic and they're a priori judgments, and that means that they tell us what to do about action, how to act, so they're synthetic, and they're a priori, so they're true in all cases. Okay, so he'll go through like ethical judgments, judgments of beauty, and all this sort of thing, judgments, logical judgments, mathematical judgments. They all fit a type, they all fit a key. Now, since this is a class in philosophy of art, obviously we're going to focus on what he calls aesthetic judgments. So let's get at least a sort of, you know, touch into this. I know that was quite a lot for an intro there, but let's finally sort of scratch the surface as to what Kant says about aesthetic judgments. And I think today the big focus will be on what he sees to be our true experience of beauty. And hopefully we'll have time, you know, right now and then a little bit after the break to see, as much as I think he owes to the empiricist and as much as I think he owes to David Hume, how different he is, and how I think Kant would certainly argue against David Hume's insistence that when we say something's beautiful or good, or, you know, has, you know, it's all that means is that it pleases our senses. That's really all it comes down to. And Kant thinks there's a lot more to it than that. So let's look at this first quote. This is a long quote, so bear with me here. Let me take a sip of water before I dive into this one. All right, so really we're looking at his philosophy of beauty. What is the beautiful for Kant? In order to distinguish whether anything is beautiful or not, we refer to the representation, not by the understanding to the object for cognition, but by the imagination. Okay, that's all a big mouthful of like jargon. Let's back up again to that picture of the cat and the person. When he says representation, he's talking about this image that I'm having of the cat, right? Okay, I see this object out there, you know, light rays come into my mind, and I see this object in a certain light. I see it from a certain angle or whatever. That's what he's referring to as representation in this quote here. Okay, so how do we know something's beautiful or not? We refer to the representation, not by the understanding. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, how does it appear to me? How does it appear to me? That's how he judges something's beautiful, not by the understanding to the object for cognition. In other words, we don't think something's beautiful because it fits a concept, because it fits a certain preconceived idea of what is supposed to be correct about the object. but it has to do also with our imagination, he says, to the subject and its feeling of pleasure and pain. We use our imagination to understand beauty through something in our representation, and it is tied to this idea of pleasure and pain. So in a certain sense, Hume was on the right track. Be careful here, though. We only want to take this slight with a great grain of salt. I don't know if we're going to have time to get into the nuts and bolts of this, but Kant distinguishes between what he calls pleasant and beautiful. They're not the same thing. They both please us, but for different reasons. So we're going to have to keep that in mind as we go through these first quotes, because these first quotes don't make that quite so clear yet. He hasn't really distinguished yet between pleasant and beautiful. So the judgment of taste is therefore not a judgment of cognition. So it's not based on rational conception. You don't think something's beautiful because it fits a concept. It's consequently not logical. It's aesthetical. And by which we understand that whose determining ground can be no other than subjective. So it is subjective in the sense that it has to do with my experience of something. That's always going to be in me for Kant. It's always going to be how the thing is represented. So it is subjective. Again, though, be careful here. This is going to come with a giant caveat. This doesn't necessarily mean that the old adage is true, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So keep that in mind. It is subjective, but in a very sorry, I had it muted. Okay, can you hear me now? I'm unmuted. Yeah, I had a malfunction with my computer. I think my hard drive is finally starting to crap out. Let's see, how many people are here? 39. Okay, everybody's still here. All right, great. Sorry, we get back to the show. You know what I think might be helpful, as annoying as this is, if I don't go into slideshow mode and I just leave the PowerPoint like it is, and I'll just keep scrolling down, because I think like I said, my hard drive it's old. I've had this computer for heck, I don't know, like 10 years maybe. And I keep saving all of these recordings, all these Zoom recordings, and it's probably like really slowing things down. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, we'll keep it like this. All right. Yeah, I probably should put an SSD. I should probably just go out and buy a terabyte or something, but I don't know. Anyway, let's get back to the quote, okay? I left off in where the italics were, I think. Every reference of representations, okay? Again, representations being how the thing appears to me. Even that of sensations may be objective, okay? So there's an objective part of it, save only reference to the feeling of pleasure and pain. So what is objective, what's true for all of us, is the categories. Okay, now you see why I had to mention the categories. Like, why is Professor Ross spending an hour on all this crap that has nothing to do with philosophy of art? It's going to help you understand the reading a little bit better. Okay, so when he's talking about what's objective in us, it's like we're all, insofar as we all organize experience with these categories of understanding, that's true. My experience is my experience, your experience is your experience, all that. But what's true about all of it, we're all experiencing it in space and time, and we're all, according to Kant, using the categories to organize our experience. But there's one thing that isn't objective about that. It's our sensation of the feeling, in reference to the feeling of pleasure and pain, by which nothing in the object is signified. So there's nothing out there in the thing itself that is, the pleasure and the pain is in me, basically. So it's not in the object signified, but through which there's a feeling in the subject as it is affected by the representation. Okay, I think I've explained that quote significantly enough, or sufficiently enough. So when we're talking about an aesthetic judgment, he says, or the judgment of taste, he says, when we're talking about taste, why does he want to call it aesthetical? To apprehend, he says, a regular purpose of building by means of one cognitive faculty is something quite different from being conscious of this representation as connected with the sensation of satisfaction. Okay, so again, when I look at a building as, oh, look, that's a nice functional building. It's very well designed. You can get in it very well. Look at it. It's a library and how much space it has. It was well designed for the books. You're using your cognitive faculty. You have a concept of library, a concept of, you know, needing space to store books, whatever. And that is basically what you're apprehending. That's different, he says. That's something quite different from being conscious of this representation as connected with the sensation of satisfaction. If it's just a nice looking building and you don't even know what kind of building it is. Oh, it's a library? Cool. I didn't know it was a library. I just thought it was a cool looking building. Thought it was like an art museum or something like that. But that's different. Those are two different experiences. Those are two different judgments that we're talking about here. So here the representation is altogether referred to the subject and its feeling of life. This is a weird, vague, I don't think he says enough about this. He elaborates on so much that he doesn't need to elaborate on, and he's very brief about stuff that he should elaborate on. This idea that when I feel something is pleasing in an aesthetical sense, not in a sort of pleasant or cognitively correct sense, but in this pure aesthetic sense, he says that it's refers to. Oh, now I think I know. I'm getting this message as your internet connection is unstable. It must be my internet. It's probably my internet and my crappy computer. But anyway, he says what happens here when I see the building as something beautiful, when I'm making this aesthetic judgment, it's tied to this sensation of satisfaction. But that is completely referred to me and my subject and a feeling of life. It's a